Let's go to our first panel. We've gathered industry experts to discuss safety management systems. SMS has been in Canada for 15 years. In the US, programs like ASAP and FOQA have improved safety for years, and we're starting to see SMS implementation here as well. SMS represents a distinctive improvement in how to manage risk using the proactive collection of risk indicators from the front lines. This safety information helps management make informed, effective decisions on risk mitigations. We have an outstanding group of government and industry leaders with us today from US and Canada. They will give their unique perspectives on what SMS is, what it does, and why it should matter to all of us. ALPA's SMS Director, Captain Nick Seemel, will be moderating this panel. Nick, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Wolfgang. And thank all of you for attending the 62nd Air Safety Forum. So here we are, the first panel of the forum. SMS has been to Air Safety Forum before, but we've never been first, so we're moving up. Today's SMS theme is enhancing aviation safety through voluntary initiatives. SMS is many things, but one of the requirements of SMS is a proper system of hazard identification. Consider that SMS fundamentally drives you into a risk management approach to your safety work. So the first step in risk management is to identify your hazards. Once you identify a hazard, you measure your risk and decide how to mitigate or accept it. There's many ways to find your hazards. You can do a qualitative risk assessment with some experts. We'll talk about SIS later. You could just use the big data from SIS. If your neighbor's doing the same thing you're doing, perhaps you could just steal his data. But let's face it, the best source of that information is from voluntary reporting from the frontline employees. I refer to it as the ouch factor. They know where their finger is going to get pinched. They know what they're not doing that they're supposed to do. They usually know when they're not compliant. Looking for those reports is your most important hazard identification process. But it's interesting. We're going to be feeding the mandatory SMS hazard identification requirement with voluntary reporting and recording. This creates a challenge. To sustain a robust hazard reporting culture, everyone involved, government, associations, and the airlines, must work together to ensure a transparent and consistent just culture. The only way to move beyond a situation where only serious incidents are reporting and into a qualitative hazard identification is when pilots, in this case, trust the integrity of the system. In situations where we've seen such trust between parties involved, we've seen big steps forward in the quality of safety information, the quality of safety investigations, and the use of data. As an ALPA Air Safety Council member, unfortunately, I've seen some big challenges with situations where these partnerships are weak and the just culture just isn't there. These solutions may not come easy. With those thoughts in mind, we have a spectacular panel this morning. Our first two speakers are from Canada. McCrorie, the Director General of Transport Canada Civil Aviation. Captain Purves, Director of Flight Ops at Jazz Aviation. Down here, most of you will know Jazz Aviation as Air Canada Express. And full disclosure, Cal's my boss. And he kept me up late last night, so ask him some hard questions. Anyway, with more than a decade of SMS regulation in Canada behind them, we look forward to hearing some of the challenges and successes they've experienced, perhaps some of their lessons learned, perhaps some of their surprises, and noting that they too moved away from an enforcement safety culture with the advent of SMS. Following the Canadian experience will be the US experience with Peggy Gilligan, the Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety at the FAA. Following to her left is Mike Quiello, the Vice President of Corporate Safety at United Airlines. With the SMS pilot program experience behind them, and as they enter into SMS regulation and the introduction of compliance philosophy, it'll be interesting to hear the challenges going forward and what their expectations are. With an Olympic theme from last week, our anchor in this relay will be Hassan, the Director of Aviation Safety at the MITRE Corporation. And as an anchor, he'll wrap up with examples of what we're doing now with data and risk, and where we can go if we continue to build the trust and confidence in the voluntary system. Sort of an SIS fusion and beyond discussion. One last thought before I hand the floor over to Aaron. When I teach SMS at the ALPA risk management course, I discuss the 5 Ps: philosophy, policy, procedure, practice, and promotion. You have to have a safety philosophy to move forward. You have to put it into a policy that's coherent and well distributed. But then most importantly, you have to have safety procedures. And in the case of voluntary reporting, following Sidney Decker, you have to make sure that those people you expect to contribute with reports know what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it. They understand the consequence of reporting or not reporting. But then the tricky part for some of our people on the panel is the practice bit. How do you assess that somebody is doing those first 3 things? They have a good philosophy, they have a good policy, and they're actually following their procedures. And that's a challenge in SMS because there's a little bit of a soft science in some of it when we talk about things like just culture. The last P is promotion. And we often think of promotion as posters and web pages and things like that. And those are very important. Getting the data out to the people that are contributing with reports is very important. But I would argue that the best way to promote safety is to be unwavering in the following of all the other SMS Ps. Follow your procedures, follow your policy, unwaveringly stick together, and stick with them. And together, if we all follow that just culture philosophy and our procedures, even when it's hard, we will have the best safety promotion available. Freedom to voluntarily report from the front lines and encouraging reporting, in my opinion, is what will enhance aviation safety. After those vitamins for the brain, I'll hand it off to Aaron.
Thanks, Nick. It's a real pleasure to be back at this event. I'd like to thank ALPA for the opportunity to speak this morning about safety management systems. We started introducing safety management systems in Canada in 2005 with our largest air carriers, covering about 90% of the data. It's 90% of the fare-paying passenger kilometers, and that followed with SMS requirements for our certified airports, where all scheduled traffic goes, our air navigation service providers, and then finally, in the last couple of years, our business aviation sector. So as a result, the vast majority of the traveling public are already benefiting from SMS in Canada. 100% of the airports they're flying into have safety management systems, and as I said, 90% of the fare-paying passenger kilometers are covered by carriers with SMS. So we were an early adopter of SMS, an early promoter of SMS, and we're quite proud of that. One of the benefits of that is we've helped to shape what SMS looks like, we'd like to think, but also we've started to reap the benefits of it. The downside of that is we didn't benefit from the lessons learned of others, and so we've got some lessons learned as we move forward. And I'd like to emphasize that we're still learning in terms of implementing SMS. So briefly this morning, I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of those lessons learned are, some of the benefits and challenges we've seen with SMS in practice, and finally give you a sense of where we're going with SMS. So first of all, some of the lessons learned, and I'd identify 3 of them. One is don't take on too much. The second is take the time to do it right. And the third is engage and create a role for stakeholders to help in terms of implementing SMS. So first of all, don't take on too much. When we started down the SMS path in 2005, that coincided with efforts to fundamentally overhaul how we managed our own organization and the introduction of a fundamentally different way of doing oversight, a more systems-level approach to oversight. Each and one of those was a huge change management challenge on its own. Doing all 3 at once created a lot of confusion within our own organization, a lot of disruption. As a result, that confusion and disruption spread to our operators and to, even quite frankly, at the political level. That confusion, that disruption started to undermine a little bit support for and understanding of what SMS was. And while we've seen success with it, there's a lot of, as I say, confusion, misunderstanding, and which led to a little bit of resistance. So that led us to a decision to slow down things and take a pause in terms of implementing SMS, because we recognized that we need to take the time to do it right. And why do you need to take the time to do it right? Well, you need to understand, first of all, work with industry, work with stakeholders, work with the community out there so that people can understand what SMS is and dispel some of the myths around SMS. We still have a challenge in Canada where people think that SMS is a form of self-regulation. It's not. It's another regulatory requirement that an operator needs to comply with. It complements our existing regulations, but there is that misunderstanding out there. You need to ask some fundamental policy questions about where you're going to require SMS. Is that sector of the industry ready for it? Is it mature enough to embrace SMS? What tools are required to help get industry ready to implement SMS? What does our staff need in this particular sector? And just because you've asked those questions for large operators doesn't mean they apply in the world of a design organization or a niche operator like a float plane operator. You need to look at those questions across the board for all of them as the platform for implementing SMS. Are some operations, quite frankly, too small? Are they just too small to reap the benefits of SMS versus the cost of implementing them? In those instances, do we need to look at something like an SMS Lite that would focus on simple risk identification mitigation rather than a full-blown SMS? Those are the policy questions that need to ask before launching into the regulatory process. We started to do that work, and we've benefited tremendously from working with our partners like the FAA and others around the world through forums like the Safety Management International Cooperation Group to look at how we can, for example, develop guidance material for small operators. And that's our role as the regulators, to develop that guidance material to help with that implementation once the regulations are in place. But then that's their third lesson learned, is that we don't have a monopoly on that particular function. And true successful implementation of SMS is going to require a role for stakeholders. And an event like this is actually, quite frankly, an opportunity to help build understanding of what SMS is and to spread the word, if you will. But we've seen some great examples in Canada where industry associations, on behalf of their members, have started to build the tools and guidance that works for that particular industry. So the Air Transportation Association of Canada, for example, has built a model SMS for all of their members. The Canadian Business Aviation Association has built an SMS, model SMS for their members, which includes gathering data and sharing data so you've got an industry-wide perspective on what the risks are rather than very small operator perspective. So getting stakeholders involved in implementing SMS is going to be another key element in terms of in moving forward. In 2013, we did a bit of a mini survey of some of the operators out there who had implemented SMS to get a sense of, we believed in SMS, we thought there were benefits, but we wanted to hear from them what the costs and the challenges, the benefits were. What we heard was that it certainly created a different culture at the top of an organization. It took time, but you started to see senior management taking safety even more seriously and an engagement on dealing with issues proactively. It helped enterprises start to identify risks and mitigate them before they became an incident rather than retroactively dealing with an issue. It helped to create that safety culture where people felt safe to report incidents and know that they would be dealt with rather than there be reprisals for reporting those types of incidents. There's costs. Those benefits are there, but there's costs. It costs money to implement, and it takes a lot of time and energy. We believe the benefits outweigh those costs, but there are costs in terms of implementing SMS. From a regulatory point of view, one of the benefits we've seen is leveraging the SMS that's in place has allowed us to deal with emerging safety issues much more quickly, more nimbly than we could through regulations. And the example I like to use is in 2011, there was an accident in northern Canada, Resolute Bay. An unstable approach, continued to land, it crashed, an infant died. And one of the recommendations coming out of the Transportation Safety Board report was that operators needed to reduce the incidence of unstabilized approaches. And the suggestion was that we needed to regulate that. Well, any regulatory process is going to take time, 2 to 3 years in the best case scenario. What we did instead was immediately issue a Canadian Aviation Safety Alert telling all of our 705 operators that this was a new emerging risk that they needed to look at in terms of the context of their own operations, put in place mitigation measures that worked for their particular operation, and then track that. We've now launched an inspection campaign to follow up and see, is that risk being mitigated through the SMSs that these operators have? If it is, we've successfully dealt with the issue that the Transportation Safety Board has identified, and much more quickly than we would have through regulation. If operators aren't doing it, it makes the case for regulating even more compelling and forcing operators to take steps to reduce the incidence of unstabilized approaches. So for us, it shows the benefits of dealing with issues much more quickly than we could do through traditional regulation. So where are we going with SMS? Well, I've talked about our 3 lessons learned. We're going to take the time to do it right. We're not going to try to do too much at the same time, and we're going to engage our stakeholders. So we've got a fairly full regulatory agenda on right now. So we are starting the initial policy work at looking at expanding SMS to the other sectors of the Canadian aviation industry. We're going to look at those policy questions that I talked about earlier and develop an implementation plan for SMS in the remaining sectors through the course of this year and into next year.
Thank you, Aaron. And Cal, your perspective from the management of an airline.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, ALPA, for the opportunity to share some of our experiences as an operator with implementing SMS and in the true spirit of SMS. A voluntary report, I did keep you up late in the bar last night, so I apologize for your voice earlier on. That was my actions. JAS adopted and embraced the move to safety management systems as defined by regulation by Transport Canada over 10 years ago. In the early stages of implementation, we needed to clearly understand what the expectations were of Transport Canada, but also what the regulator envisioned for us on the communication piece. There's a communication piece to ensure that our principal operating inspector assigned to JAS understands what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how to report the issues that we have. So firstly, we had to deal with that. We also needed to clearly communicate to the entire employee group the obligations that they had under SMS and their accountability for a truly non-punitive collaborative reporting system that was at its heart about a safe work environment for all employees. The employees represent an environment that voluntarily has to self-report the issues that are on hand so that the management team can understand what they see day to day. Without that, we really are running blind. We don't see all of the issues that are ongoing. So to start this process, we first looked to define a non-punitive understanding with ALPA and ensure that we had a true collaborative approach to communicating what SMS was to the employee group, to the pilots, and get their full participation and buy-in, because they truly are the leaders in a safety culture in our organization. Prior to the rollout to the pilot group, we also needed to ensure that the labor management team understood what SMS was as well. We needed them to truly understand that there was a value to a non-punitive voluntary reporting system, not to be confused with non-culpable, but a non-punitive, proactive, and reactive reporting culture that encouraged self-reporting of issues. The management team also needed to understand the direction that their relationship would be with the labor groups, as this was contrary to the normal, discipline versus voluntary actions when you have an incident or an accident, or you just have an event that occurred. So we also needed to ensure that the supervisors clearly understood their role as supervisors in discipline, but also in promoting SMS to the employee group. As mentioned earlier, reporting under SMS is non-punitive, but it's not non-culpable. There is a culpable aspect to a SMS system. There is a responsibility of the employees to respect the safety policy, and there are exclusions to any policy that an employer puts in place. Should the employee demonstrate one of those exclusions, there can be discipline. But before you talk about discipline with that employee group, what you clearly need to understand is, from a safety aspect, why did this occur? What was involved? Was there an organizational aspect to this? Was there an HF, human factors aspect to it? Or was it just surely a culpable piece? In a human factors issue, if it's culpable, what we really need to look at before discipline is coaching, is training, is progressive discussion on the issue, so that we can actually change the behavior at heart. This is a value-added aspect of the change in any just culture relationship in a collaborative SMS policy, and we needed to ensure that the employees and the management team both understood this together and gained that level of trust. We were challenged early on when we first started into the road of SMS, just a couple years actually into SMS, where we had an incident that saw management and the labor group struggle with direction on where to go on an exclusionary aspect. What we needed to quickly do and understand was how to work together to identify our differences and our understanding of the roles, our wants, and our needs before we really took a direction and a turn that would negatively impact our transition through SMS. I think we managed our way through that event, but it clearly identified to us that this is not an us against them process. It truly needed to be a fully collaborative and fluid trust between the pilot group, the management group, and the company to make this actually work. From a day-to-day aspect in SMS, 10 years in, 12 years in, from a flight operations team, the pilots in our organization account for almost 70% of all voluntary reporting systems. We use that information to develop much of our SOP philosophy, much of our training programs. This is all based on the reports that we gain through SMS. One area we had very good success with early on and continue to have good success with is risk assessments and risk analysis. What we do as a norm is we actually include the ALPA training team, the ALPA safety team, and some of the ALPA committee teams into our early risk analysis on fleet development, new airport operations, and things like that. We want to ensure that the frontline employees have an opportunity to tell us what they believe is the right way to work and to act when we make changes within the organization. So we adopted that fairly early on, and we continue to manage it with ALPA and with some of their committees. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But we are learning, we are growing together, and that's a key aspect of the transition to SMS. It's about collaboration with the employee group, collaboration with the regulator, full disclosure to the regulator, and understanding that each and every employee, whether you're a pilot, you're an accountable executive, or you're a manager, it's an obligation to report under SMS. I think the environment that we continue to grow at Jazz is a positive one in a safety culture, and moving forward, there's plenty to learn. There's plenty more from the regulator that we need to clearly understand, but we're moving forward, I think, in the right direction with safety. Thanks.
Thank you, Cal. And Peggy, if you could move on with the American experience.
Sure, Nick. Thank you, and thanks, ALPA, for inviting me back again. I do appreciate these opportunities to get together. But before I start with where we are and where we're going, I'd like to talk about where we've been and how we got here. And I think you'll see that we've had a natural set of steps, a progression that has taken us naturally to safety management systems and the compliance philosophy that the administrator announced last year. And I think you'll see that we've addressed many of the challenges that Aaron and Cal have highlighted as we've gone down that path. So, time for audience participation. How many of you were active ALPA members and flying the line in 1996? Then, like me, you remember the catastrophic failures that we had that year. ValueJet in the Florida Everglades and TWA 800 off the coast of Long Island, New York. At that time, there were real questions about whether this industry, and by industry I mean all of you and the companies you work for and the manufacturers who build your products, because I got called on that one time at this conference. You are all a part of the industry. But there were real questions whether this industry was dedicated to providing safe transportation. And there was real question whether the federal government and the Federal Aviation Administration was even relevant to that discussion. There were two commissions that were brought together then that came and made two fundamental recommendations that have brought us down this path. ALPA was a key player in both of those commissions, and because of that, we had first the commitment that we as an industry, all of us, would reduce the fatal accident rate in air transportation 5-fold in 10 years, an 80% reduction by the year 2007. And the second key element was that we as an industry would come together and establish a safety agenda, a prioritized safety agenda that would get us to that goal of 5-fold reduction. And ALPA was a key player in setting those requirements. 10 years later, 1997, there was in fact an 83% reduction in the fatal accident rate for air transportation in the United States. In part, we accomplished that goal through the development of the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. And again, ALPA was a key member of that team, continues to be a key member of that team to this day. In those first 10 years, we implemented 70 safety enhancements, none of them by rulemaking, the point that Aaron made earlier, all of them by acknowledgement by each player in the industry that there were things each of us could do to mitigate risks that we had not fully taken, and we had not yet fully taken those actions. Those early enhancements had specific impact for pilots. We had a big focus on standard operating procedures, starting with standard, making them standard, training, testing, and evaluating the people were following standard operating procedures. We developed specialized training to address specific risks for controlled flight into terrain and loss of control accidents. All of that contributed to that 80% reduction. At the same time, we all began to understand and really become committed to voluntary programs. Congress actually gave us the authority to protect data developed through voluntary programs from public disclosure. ALPA was a key player in getting that protection, in making the case, in helping Congress understand that if we're going to collect voluntary data for the purposes of enhancing safety, we need to assure that it is used only for that purpose. And without that protection, we would have struggled in being able to meet that commitment. One of the requirements in that statute, though, was that as an industry, we share the data. And so 40 people or so, some of them in this room, got together and began a process that we call InfoShare. InfoShare will be meeting next month in Kansas City, where we have over 900 people already registered to attend that conference. InfoShare has helped us build the level of trust that you heard Aaron and Cal talk about as an industry, the trust in one another, that we really do understand that the only way we're going to continue down the path of safety enhancements is by understanding what the risks are, what the hazards are in our system, and addressing them together to reduce those risks. The next sort of natural step was now to get beyond the forensic review of past accidents and incidents and try to understand what the data can tell us before we have any kind of catastrophic failure. And so this industry became committed to the Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing Program, or ASIAS. And once again, ALPA was a key leader in putting that program in place and in supporting it to this day. All of those steps have led all of us to the realization that the next natural step is a safety management system. So we may not have regulated that requirement as early as our neighbors in Canada did, but I think we've grown toward it, we've built toward it as a community. And that's why I think our transition now to safety management systems is moving very smoothly, not without some bumps, but we are well along the road of implementing safety management systems. And those key elements, the most important from our perspective, the identification of hazards, the identification of mitigations or ways to manage those hazards, and the evaluation that those are effective, and then sharing that data with one another. But I think from all of those pieces, the most important impact that we've seen over the course of the last 20 years is the change we've seen in the safety culture throughout this industry. We have come to understand in the FAA, and I think all of you, I hope, share this perspective, that everyone who works in this industry is by nature a voluntary complier. No one made you become pilots. No one made someone start your airlines. Each of you understood you were taking on the responsibility of meeting a set of safety standards and demonstrating that you complied with those in order to get that certificate that you hold so dear. Your employers did the same. Those who run your maintenance organizations did the same, your training centers. Everyone in this industry voluntarily took on the responsibility to meet safety standards. Well, if we go into it with that assumption that we are all voluntary compliers, but that this is a very complex system where things can go wrong, where people make mistakes, then the right action to take is to assume that we want to be in compliance and figure out what went wrong and work together to come back into compliance. And that's what led the administrator in the direction of the compliance philosophy. If you begin with the assumption that we all mean to be in compliance, then anything that happens in this system we need to learn from, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again. As you heard from our friends in Canada, they too are taking that same approach. And that's why we see safety management systems and the compliance philosophy as the next natural step for this industry. Government, operators, certificate holders, airmen, everyone in the system. It's the next natural step to assure that we continue to build on the outstanding safety record that we have. We lost our last passenger in U.S. air transportation in February of 2009. That is an amazing accomplishment. And each of you in this room has contributed to that. And so have the companies you've worked for, and so have all of your colleagues, and so have the air traffic controllers, and so have those of us in the regulatory organization. We have much to be proud of and much to build upon as we move down the safety management system road together.
Thank you, Peggy. And from United Airlines perspective, Mike?
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here to see friends and colleagues. It's good to make reacquaint with everybody. From United Airlines perspective, I would tell you it's about managing risk, right? Right now we have 730 aircraft, 735 flying factories, operated by what I would say is the finest pilot group in the world. They take these aircraft, $150 million a piece, fly them all over the world, generate $100,000 in revenue every day, every time, and they safely fly. The last fatal hull loss United Airlines had was back in 1991 in Colorado Springs with a 737. That's a quarter of a century, absent the tragedy of 9/11, of safe flying. But safe flying is safe flying, but it's not without risk, right? And so the risk model goes up and down basically every day. And so our job, both as the industry and working with our friends in the FAA and with ASIAS and Hassan's group, is to understand what is that risk and what's your appetite for risk, right? And just because you're out of compliance doesn't mean you're really unsafe. You know, you're doing 61 miles an hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. Are you unsafe? No, but you're out of compliance, and our job is to get back into compliance. If you're doing 45 in a 60, you could be unsafe if it's raining, if it's traffic, if it's snowing. And so how do you understand what the risk is? And just because you're in compliance doesn't necessarily mean you're safe. It just means you're in compliance. And just because you're out of compliance doesn't mean you're necessarily unsafe. That's where the risk goes on top of that. And I was talking to a member of the United board, and they were trying to understand talk to me about reactive, predictive, and proactive risk, right? And proactive safety. And I said, okay, so real simple example is a spill in the terminal. Somebody walks by and they fall, and that's reactive. We clean up the spill and we investigate. Proactive is that somebody sees the spill and they clean it up before somebody falls. Predictive is we know that if there's a spill in the terminal, somebody may fall and may get hurt. Now, how do you put the risk model on top of that? Well, that little puddle in the terminal is high risk, risk being probability times severity. That same puddle in the corner of the parking lot, in the employee lot over by the hangars in Chicago is low risk. And so that's how you start putting the risk model in on everything that we do. When you look at CRM, we all had to learn how to talk to each other in the 80s, right? When I first started flying in 1981 for the airlines, it was a different world. And so we had to teach each other how to talk to each other back in the 80s. Now we need to understand what to talk about, right? And that's threat and error management. And all that's data-driven when you think about it. And so, we have 70% commonality in what we do, and there's 30% variability in the operation. So the runway is the same size runway, the airplane is the airplane, but the crew may be new crew, old crew, first flight of the rotation. The weather impact, is it crosswind, is it headwind, is it snowing, is it raining, is it day, is it night, and that's where the variability comes in. And so wouldn't it be great if we can give you a tool that says, when all these things come together, here are your threats. I mean, think about that. I would have loved to have that. Put it in front of me and saying, you're going to fly from here to there. You're flying at this time of day. Here are your threats based on the data, right? Based on the data that we see. And so that's our challenge right now. And we're actually getting there at United from the ground side, where we can get a station manager can put in all the variables of the day, bag count, load factor, jetways out of service, meteorological data, hit enter, and it says, here's your threats. Winds are going to be 30 knots. Make sure you have the high wind plan in effect. Where's the high wind plan? Click here, and it pulls up the latest high wind plan out of the database. That's where this whole business is going. And in that case, the station that has a snow event every 5 years gets the advantage of the Chicago that has a snow event every 5 days, because we're sharing data. And just think of it from that perspective. And then think of it from our perspective as pilots, that if we can just start sharing this data, get lessons learned, I would tell you, I don't believe anybody goes to work at United Airlines, has an incident and says, I did that just to see what my Quiello and Howard Terry are going to say. I mean, it's just not what happens. So you have to understand what drove that, what was the issues that drove the event. So how do we use data to change our processes, identify hazards, and to understand risk? I mean, data is prevalent. We have 28 787s. A half a terabyte of information is downloaded on every flight. A half a terabyte of information. Tons of data coming in. You know, other businesses use data for just about everything. Home Depot uses it for relational buying. You know, you go into Home Depot, you'll see caulk in 10, 12 spots in the Home Depot, because they know when you buy this, you're going to buy that. And so think about that in our terms. Walmart, there's a hurricane headed to South Florida right now, and Walmart will tell you when a hurricane heads to South Florida, people buy Pop-Tarts, and they buy strawberry Pop-Tarts, and they buy Pop-Tarts because you can eat them raw, right? McDonald's up in Chicago knows hamburger sales by the temperature outside. They can tell you when it's 86 degrees, they're going to sell this many hamburgers, 89 degrees, they sell that. It's all data driven. And the best one is Target. I mean, Target, you may have read an article in Forbes magazine where people were registering for baby gifts. They use that data and buying habits to predict first, second, and third trimester sales. And they can tell, they know when people are pregnant, possibly before they know when they're pregnant. And it's actually a great article in Forbes. You should read the article because it's about how they're starting to put all this data together. So, you know, when you think about it, it's like when you get an 80% chance of rain outside. What the weatherman is saying is that when all these things come together, it rains 80% of the time. And then you have to decide your appetite for risk. If I'm working in the yard, am I going to take an umbrella? Probably not. If I'm going to a formal event, yes. And that's where the risk equation comes in. So in closing, our job, and I think working together with everybody, is how do we look at data and lower risk? And it's not about looking at the data of the individual pilot. It's about looking at the data of the system. And I would tell you, in my years in both being a line pilot and management, I'll give you a quick story. I was a chief pilot, and a pilot came in with a heavyweight landing one day, and he said, Mike, my flaps blew back right over the approach lights. I started to settle, we caught it, but man, it did scare me. And so we did an analysis, so that's one data point, right? So we did an analysis, and what we found was the speeds in the FMS were wrong. The flaps blew back at 172, I believe it was, and the approach speed was like 171. And I mean, who can fly plus or minus 1 knot in gusty winds, right? And so the poor guy, the flaps blew back. When we put it out, it was interesting because I had about 10 more people come in and say, you know, the exact same thing happened to me. And so how do we take those data points, put them together, and get predictive to that versus getting reactive? So for that individual was reactive. But if I had those 10 data points and sent them off to engineering, we probably could have been predictive. And so that's what it's all about. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Hassan.
Go ahead, Hassan.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you for the invitation. So, you know, we're really fortunate that with the advances in SMS and the voluntary programs that we've just talked about, you know, we're in a position now to have very rich sources of data, both narrative and digital data, that can be used in a proactive way to identify hazards and develop mitigations. And in the recent past, there have been new sources of data that have become available on a very large scale that can really help put a more complete picture in terms of what the risks are and develop more effective mitigations and safety solutions. So I'd like to just go through just briefly this morning, highlighting some of the data sources within SIS that was mentioned. SIS is approaching the 9th year since it was established. In fact, Peggy and I were on a panel here at ALPA on this panel talking about it in the early days. Started with 4 airlines. United was one of the first. Today, there are 45 airlines participating in SIS. That's just a tremendous advancement. There are a number of data sources available, starting with FOCA that was mentioned. Today, we're approaching 20 million FOCA flights within SIS. These are all de-identified. With respect to ASAP that was mentioned earlier, in SIS there are nearly 200,000 ASAP reports, de-identified ASAP reports. And these are not just crew reports, but cabin and maintenance and dispatch that are really maturing very nicely. And the intake of these reports are nearly 4,300 per month. That is really goes to the reporting culture that's out there with all of the leadership and the various programs. That's just fantastic. Let's not forget about ATSAP. That's the Air Traffic Controller Reporting Program, modeled after ASAP, in fact, with great collaboration between NATCA and ALPA over the years. We have nearly 100,000 ATSAP reports in the database at the rate of about 1,000 reports. So that's on the voluntary programs, and that's just, again, leadership and promotion, I think, that was talked about earlier. Beyond that, there are other significant data sources that are now available. With respect to the FAA's radar data, there are nearly 100 million flights now in SIS of what we call threaded track. These are radar tracks. And in addition to that, of course, there are other contextual information that really help paint that bigger picture. That includes weather and wind, airport infrastructure information, air procedures and airspace types of information. And all of that really brings SIS to be now the world's largest repository of safety information. And that really goes to the leadership, the collaboration, and especially with ALPA playing a big role in establishing that, as Peggy mentioned. I will just say that SIS is co-chaired by Peggy and Michael. They oversee the SIS Executive Board that manages all that is happening within SIS, and they can speak chapter and verse about the benefits of the program and how it works. I will add that to deal with all of this data, this significant data, there's been significant advancements in terms of data analytics that's processing all of this data, making sure that timely results are provided to all of the teams. And there are many, many teams that are working within the SIS program, and that's very important. And a recent initiative within SIS is what we call the Fusion Initiative program that's really taking SIS to the next stage. That is, how can we best take advantage of all of this information in a way that provides that complete picture, the 360 picture. And so what is happening is that SIS is building flight stories for every single flight in the National Airspace System that happens, tagging that flight with all sorts of other contextual information, de-identifying and then aggregating. Because within SIS, it's not the individual flights that's important, it's really the aggregation and the metrics and the statistics. And so I think that is really just a brief summary of what has happened. And to provide all of this data, and we talked about this earlier, it requires trust. And as my friend Randy Kanegi, who's in the back, reminded me recently, as a foundation for trust, a foundation is agreed upon, well-defined, and transparent set of processes that are out there. People understand what those are, with specific roles and responsibilities. And that really helps to build that trust and to continue to learn from these processes. Are they perfect? No. Have there been bumps along the way? Yes. Are we learning lessons as we go along and improving those processes? Yes. Within SIS, we're on version 8 or 9 of the P&O document. And that really goes to really the lessons learned that everybody's learning. You know, how do you de-identify the information? How do you aggregate the information? How do you, who sees what results? Those are all part of the processes, and we continue to improve those. And again, ALPA, and I'll shout out to Chuck Hogeman and others who've really provided that leadership over the years. Without that leadership, we would not be where we are. So anyway, that's just a quick summary to kind of wrap it up. And again, thanks for the invitation, and look forward to the discussions.
Well, thank you all for accepting the invitations. And following with what you said, Hassan, can you give us an example of, a de-identified example of how you used your data and understood a safety risk and then were able to mitigate it somewhat?
Well, Michael and I were just talking about that yesterday. There have been many examples, throughout the past 9 years as the commercial aviation safety team, in fact, moved out on not accident, data, but really, causal factors and leading indicators. And there have been many safety enhancements that were voluntarily adopted by the commercial aviation safety team. One of the examples early on, in the early part of the program, were these TAWS alerts that were being reported by individual crew in the Northern California area. And there was individual crews, and as we kind of pulled the data from multiple airlines together, a pattern began to emerge relating to flight paths to Oakland. And going through the analysis and going through all of the data with the teams, there were several things that emerged. One was related to the TAWS software on board. Some of the releases were not updated, the algorithms. The second one, as I recall, related to MVAs that were not harmonized with the TAWS software update that they had, and MVAs were ultimately redesigned. The other one was the paths near Mount Diablo to runway 28 that were not well designed. So CAST, took all of that data. Again, these are data-driven precursors that were found. Developed thoughtful safety enhancements. Implemented those, and as part of CAST and SIS, what they do is to monitor what happens afterwards. And we saw a precipitous decline in TAWS alerts after the implementation. And the last TAWS alert that we have in our database that we saw was in 2013. So that's closest the safety management circle, as we've talked about, and that's just one of those examples.
Thank you, Hassan. And thank you all. Like I say, especially thank you for accepting our invitation to come today. We have quite a bit of time left, and as I indicated earlier, this panel is about interaction. So we're hoping that those of you in the audience can, after hearing all that and trying to digest it, to come up with a few questions. Looks like we might have one here.
To start with SMS, it's data-driven, and we all know that. It's all about the data, trend analysis, then risk assessments, corrections, and monitoring. But the data comes from the users, if you will, the flyers, in our case, the pilots. Without the trust of the pilots that the information that they're going to put in is protected, the data is going to dry up. Or they'll put in a report that's a CYA report that doesn't give us any information. We fight that on the company side, the FAA side, and the association side every day, trying to get them to trust the programs. Compliance philosophy has come into play. Data is obviously the goal. We just had our first case yesterday that was taken care of with a pilot under the new compliance philosophy where he actually got himself into trouble with an FAA inspector during a flight. It was disposed of yesterday with essentially no action. The FAA did an interview with the pilot, and the corrective action, if you will, was just a conference explaining what went wrong and having the pilot explain back how he's never going to do that again. It was a great example of where we're going in this industry as far as getting more information and making things right. It's kind of a kinder and gentler approach, while still preserving the baseball bat of enforcement action if it's still needed. On the company side, for us at United, we're still sometimes fighting with flight operations. Our safety counterparts are with us for the most part on almost all of these issues. But a chief pilot sometimes thinks that they need to do something to a pilot so that the FAA won't do something to a pilot. That's what they tell us each time that they do this. I'm kind of protecting them by doing this aggressive action. And that's where we kind of come into a little bit of an ask of the FAA through you, Peggy, especially. The word to our flight operations, and I know it's across the industry, compliance philosophy allows you to do things that don't include yanking a pilot's license or giving them a 709 ride or something else. Those are reserved for extreme cases. The companies do not need to take aggressive action against the pilot. In a lot of cases, some of these things are mandatory reports that we have to give. We call them IORs at United, and our flight operations people will take action against those because they'll say, wow, if I don't do this, the FAA is going to go after this guy. The FAA is not going after that guy, not anymore, and not that way. And so if you could help us by getting that message to our flight operations people throughout the industry, that would help us, and it would also allow the pilots to have a little more trust in the safety programs, the safety system, and SMS overall.
Well, I think the compliance philosophy, as you've indicated, really has taken hold within the FAA. Excuse me. I visit our offices, our administrator visits the offices regularly, and we're seeing a very positive acceptance of the compliance philosophy. Our inspectors want to be able to work that way with all their certificate holders. How it's permeating in the company is something obviously the company leadership needs to deal with. But I meet with the A4A Safety Council and Ops Councils. We reiterate wherever we can that what we're looking for is compliance. And again, reiterating that people are voluntary compliers. They mean to be in compliance. As long as they're willing and able, we ought to find a way then, as you described, to understand what happens so that we can figure out how to help the individual, if it's an individual shortcoming, get back into compliance, or if it's a systemic issue, that we can address it at the systems level. So we'll certainly continue that outreach, that education for all of our certificate holders, and hopefully you'll see it reflected in how you're interacting with the company.
Thank you.
Aaron, Canadian experiences, any comment on that?
And I guess there's two sides to that equation, right? Like, so we call it our progressive approach to enforcement, and it's not unique to SMS, and it's really about trying to understand where does that non-compliance coming from and what's the risk associated with that. So taking punitive action in an instance where non-compliance is the result of ignorance is not necessarily going to solve the problem. We're in the business of the behavior change. So sometimes the tool we need to use is going to be education rather than enforcement. We keep that enforcement tool remains there. If anything, I'd argue in Canada, and Cal may have a different view on this, but I think if anything in Canada, we've probably seen the pendulum go a little bit too far where we've tended to be non-punitive, and there's probably instances where we should have taken punitive action. If you look at some of the recent Transportation Safety Board reports, they're kind of pointing to the fact that maybe we've been too progressive in some of our enforcement action, and that we need to make, as I think the questioner pointed out, we still need to have that bat and use that bat in some instances. So we're trying to get the balance right there. I still think the progressive approach is the way to go, but it's not about giving up that bat. It's about using it when you need to use it. And I like to gain kind of how Cal talked about from an organizational level, culpable versus non-punitive. But from a regulator point of view, if an organization is willfully not following regulations, is not trying to comply, I start with where Peggy is in terms of people want to comply, but we do have instances where people are flagrantly not complying with rules repeatedly. There's a limit to progressive enforcement in that context. We need to take action. We need to shut them down.
I would add, in days past, somebody had an escape, and the first thing you did as a management person was put the person in the simulator because you wanted to make them whole again, right? Because once they have the escape, you throw them in the simulator and it makes them whole. And that was in a way to protect the individual too, because then the FAA could come to us and say, what did you do? We put them in the simulator and off they go. They're fully qualified again. I would say today, under this new philosophy, and we have new chief pilots coming in and coming out, and it's a big education process for a lot of them, especially from my end. But I would tell you that if you have a pilot that's performing at this level, and all of a sudden something happens, you got to understand what caused it, right? And it's usually, I mean, you just don't know. I mean, it could be a personal problem. I mean, it could be a child just passed away. It could be family issues. It could be a brain tumor. Something happens when a pilot's up here and all of a sudden the performance drops. And I think under this new philosophy, we're going to start looking into more and more of that and to understand what actually caused it and not jump to certain conclusions anymore. And I think that's in my conversations with Bob. How do we educate the management? Because you're looking at it from both sides. You have this known event, you scag the tail, you scag the wing, and then you have the safety side of it where we're trying to get the information, do a good investigation, understanding what really precipitated it, and then coming with a corrective action, whether that's individual or system corrective action, we just don't know. So we just need to stand back a little bit, and luckily at United Airlines with our certificate management office, they allow the safety department to kind of do that, and because we have a good reputation of understanding what's really going on. When you get new chief pilots in, it's an education on all of our parts. It's responsibility for all of us to educate them as to how we're going to go forward.
Yeah, just like a comment too also on a couple of the comments that made. I'm the chief pilot for our airline, and the first thing that we did when we started SMS was we brought in our management labor team. We brought them all together, and we brought our director of safety for ALPA into that meeting. Made sure that the entire management team that was responsible to the labor group understood what the vision was from both the company side and from the labor side as far as non-punitive reporting and our philosophies on a just culture. The other thing that is important with Transport Canada is it's not that there's no enforcement action. What there is oversight in tell me what you're doing with this SMS report, how are you managing the risk from that report, and let me know what you find. And we can work with you then on whether or not we move forward with this. But primarily, the first question from the regulator isn't what are you doing about it or what are you doing to the pilot, it's how is this evolving in your SMS system?
I remember that meeting. My first question to your group was SMS. What's the most important letter? We'll leave that for everybody to think about. Anyway, you're making this moderator very happy. We have another question from the floor.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, Nick. Thank you and to the panel for a great discussion on this. I'd like to follow on with what Bob had asked, but switch to one of the other legs of the stool. The FAA has established guidelines and procedures for ASAP and FOQA. I am Dan Coogan. I am the Director of Safety Information Analysis Programs here at ALPA. And over the last several days in meetings and workshops, I've heard from a number of our members who say, when we discuss issues, yeah, but that's not the way my FAA operates that way. So I wonder if the panel could discuss that on how our members in these individual programs can help get the FAA on board on the national level and the guidance and the guidelines that are already set up. Thank you.
So you're right, there are national guidelines and an advisory circular related to how programs are established. And then there are the individual agreements that are reached within each of the individual airlines. And there are some differences for reasons that all of you have some different practices at your airlines. But I do think overall we manage ASAP programs pretty consistently across the country. So I'm a little surprised. I'm not exactly sure I know exactly what you're referring to. But I think more importantly, as we go forward, we may always maintain ASAP programs because that's what we know and we're comfortable with them. But under SMS, we're coming to the conclusion that we don't necessarily need standalone programs like that. Through SMS, you've got to collect information. The company needs to have information about what's happening, and they need reporting from their employees. And if they want to call that ASAP and follow the airworthiness, the advisory circular, great. If they want to call it something else and do it in a different way that they work out with their labor partners, that's okay too. And what we see happening ultimately is all of it feeds into the safety management system, and there aren't sort of these independent lines of all these independent programs, but the airlines themselves, and then we at the systems level, are able to see that merged data, kind of the way Hassan's already been talking about it, so that we're seeing the fuller picture for each of the events or whatever it is that's being reported and can get much closer to what the root cause was. So if there are inconsistencies, usually we do hear that from one or the other partners in the program. And we always work with our certificate management office to make sure that we're clear on what the FAA role and responsibilities and guidance is about those programs. So if there's something in particular you want to share with me afterward, I'll be glad to do that. But
Right, yeah.
we are looking at improving how we can manage those across at the national level.
All right, thank you.
I commented that in Canada, we have, right from the start, we never had a formal program like ASAP. It just, the reporting structure was just built into your SMS at your airline. It was part of your approved procedures that you would have some method of doing that. So the Transport Canada had more of an oversight view of it than actually being on an ERC. So our approach was, as you say, where you could possibly evolve to here. And next, you guys probably know better than I do who's next. It's very bright up here.
Hi, Kevin Calori, United Airlines. And two questions, actually. Do vendors interface with an airline's SMS program? And do airlines require vendors to have an SMS program?
So from United Airlines perspective, all our contracts going forward are requiring an SMS for our vendors. And so they're required to go into an SMS program, and we're actually helping them get there. It's an important part of it. You know, when you look at the SAP programs, United has 7 SAP programs. Our pilot SAP program is an unbelievable resource. We get 1 report per pilot, around 12,000 reports a year. Our dispatchers, we get 600 against 400 dispatchers. But the pilot reports are the interesting ones because, and when I talk to my colleagues at Airport Ops, and I said, you know, the pilots see it all. Above wing, below wing, station to station. They're an unbelievable resource if you want to know how the operation's going. And so we need to, you know, that needs to be a clear channel into the organization with the other data sources, but also with our vendors. As we go more and more into outsourcing for fueling and things like that, we need to really understand what's happening. And I talk about that absentee workforce, you know, those flying factories all over the world. I need to know not only what's going on with the factory, right, but what's happening with the external forces to the factory. You know, those are unbelievable assets when you think about $150, $200, $300 million aircraft. We need to know how they're being handled, how they're being touched. So SMS is an important part of all that. I hope that answers your question.
And
Thank you.
Cal, our safety and quality department does the same thing. When they look at a new vendor, they always have to build a bridge for the SMS reporting.
We do, absolutely. Any new vendor goes through a process with us where we evaluate, you know, their policies and their procedures. We do a bit of a QA, I guess, really is what we do on the new vendor. So.
Yeah, so, you know, I would say that, you know, quality assurance reports up to me also. And so we go out and make sure that their manuals and the processes and procedures are proper, right? But now we have to understand, are they executing against those? And that's where SMS comes in. I mean, you can have this unbelievable book on the shelf, but if nobody follows it, what good is it, right? And so that's why we need to have SMS systems. We need to have ramp LOSAs, peer-to-peer LOSA evaluations to understand what's really going on in the operation. Because sometimes you'll get a management audit that says they're at 98% compliance, and you get a ramp LOSA audit that says they're 70%, and you get my QA team goes in and says it's 70%, and then you get the FAA goes in and says it's 70%, and then you go to the management system and say, why are you seeing 98 and we're seeing 70? And so you need to have these checks and balances in addition to understanding, are your manuals proper?
And next question over there.
Hey, good morning. Chuck Hogeman, Aviation Safety Chair for ALPA, and Nick, great panel. My question is actually tilted towards Peggy, Michael, and Hassan, but I'd also like to hear from Canada on this as well. As Hassan pointed out, we've worked very, very hard to develop a SIAS, and Peggy, as you know, a SIAS is the fuel system for CAST and all the great work that we're doing there. And that is the product of safety programs at our individual airlines that are worked on very, very tightly. I'm becoming more concerned with the commercially available data sources that you can now get that are well outside of what we have for a SIAS. And the use of those commercial services that have not been vetted but are popular and are widespread and potential influence, particularly in safety management. And I think that is a real concern of mine. Do you have any ideas for protecting, barricading, compartmentalizing those kinds of data sources to be used in certainly official work in safety enhancements, both at the airline, at the national level, and making sure that any data stream that we're going to use to make assessments in our safety management systems is vetted properly? I'd like to hear certainly from you three, but I'd also like to get the take from Canada on that as well.
Yeah, jump in just to kind of just provide a little bit background on this. There are a number of vendors, dozens of vendors worldwide that do provide some of these services. And they're basically, the airplane is well equipped, through ADS-B, multilateration, and other technologies. Information can be readily collected and archived for multiple different uses, commercial uses. And we've seen some of these products. I've got one on my iPhone. So, it's just a matter of time, maybe, here in the US, maybe elsewhere around the world, that people can bring some of this together, use it for some of these safety applications. So I think there needs to be some discussion around this, and how would you go about actually maybe not stopping it, but maybe leveraging it in some smart ways and some thoughtful ways to really help advance safety. So I think it's an opportunity, but it does have some potential pitfalls and risks that I think we need to understand as an industry, and figure a way forward to really leverage this technology.
So I would add that when you look at the SIAS program, a CAS program, it's multiple data sources coming together. I mean, unbelievable amounts of data coming in from different sources. When you look at something like my Flight Track app, and I can point to that aircraft and I can see the transponder, and that's just one data point. So Chuck, I would say that as we build the SIAS program and we continue to build it, it's an iterative process, and it's certainly not set in stone right now. We need to understand how many data sources we need to pull in, look at it as an aggregate and not as that one snapshot of that airplane on my flight app that's 252 knots, right? And you look at it from that perspective, but understand how you bring everything in, that the SIAS program and with all our stakeholders, we can look at it and say, okay, that is a sanctioned data source that we need to use to get a blended view of something versus one data point, because one data point is useless. And I think when you look at things like after Sully landed in the river, within 15 minutes you had the flight track, right? What did that mean other than you knew his flight track? And so you need to get that blended view. And I think working together, we can say, do we want to bring in that data source? Is that a valuable data source, or is that just something that's going to create noise for the system?
Right. So what they said. But I think, and this has been something I think in CAST and SIAS we've all been concerned about. What we don't want is at some point to have dueling data that suggests, no, this is the number one priority, no, this is, no, that is, no, this is. And so we've really tried to position SIAS and CAST as sort of the go-to location for, at this point in time anyway, the best, cleanest, because MITRE does a lot to clean up the data and to make sure that what we're comparing is apples to apples and those kinds of things. And that's something you and ALPA can help with as well. Make sure you're using those kinds of data sources and that you're encouraging that the place to go for aviation safety analysis is through the programs that we as a community have put together, where we have vetted the data, where we know we can rely on what we're finding and what it's telling us. I think to Hassan's point, you're never going to shut people off from finding stuff and putting it up somewhere. But if we can establish, where the best source of data is and why some of those others are less reliable, ideally, Congress and others will ask for data from these organizations so that they can rely on what they're getting.
You know, I started off by saying that as an early adopter, there were certain advantages, but I'd say this is an area in which, at least from my point of view as the regulator, I'm jealous when I look south. We haven't built that infrastructure around the SIAS and CAS, for example, and I think that's a bit of a gap in our program. In terms of data specifically, what we are seeing is, say, for example, I'll use the Canadian Business Aviation Association. They're becoming a data collator, gatherer on behalf of their members, and we're working with them to build our trust and confidence in what they have there. So we have that. It's a voluntary program. It's a voluntary approach, but we're going in there to kind of validate and so that it does have some strength. Ultimately, it's how the individual operators, though, are going to use that data to implement their safety management systems, and that's where the kind of the proof is in the eating of the pudding. Are they actually fully adopting and implementing, or are they paying lip service to it? And that's an oversight question.
Any follow-up, Chuck? Or, no? Good. I think, Mike, you're next.
Hey, thanks for coming, and I can't believe I've got everybody on this panel who can answer this question for me. First off, I'm Mike Schulz. I represent all these people on the issues and analysis team at ASIAS. A few info shares back, I was invited to a luncheon, and we were discussing a program where Canadian Airlines would come and become part of ASIAS. And for a number of different reasons, that kind of got put on hold. My question is there still an appetite to do that? I think it would be a tremendous addition, and it would be beneficial not only for American Airlines, but for Canadian Airlines as well. And I'm wondering, has anybody up there been discussing this, or is this something, am I catching you off guard here, or?
No, absolutely not. We've had the discussions for sure with MITRE and ASIAS in being involved. I think, as you said, it did stall probably about a year or so ago.
Yep.
So our VP of Safety is still engaged in the opportunity, and I'm not sure where it's at actually from a contract or a regulatory aspect of as being involved in it, but yeah, it's still something on the radar for us.
Are you guys going to come to InfoShare in Kansas City?
Yep, I was there last time in Philadelphia for the InfoShare as well,
Okay.
and I'll be joining down in Kansas
Okay,
City too.
let's try to get together and get that moving again, because it looked like it would be beneficial for everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
And so I got a question over here.
Yeah, good morning. Robert Fulton. I'm with the Airline Pilots Association. I am Canadian, and I am a user of the SMS system, a very good SMS system that we do have at our property. Question for you, Mike. You've got a big challenge ahead of you. A lot of airplanes, a very, very big pilot population. And I guess one of the things that I want to know is how are you going to accept the, how are you going to accept the changes as far as receiving your reports from your pilots? Are they going to change? Is it going to change? Is there going to be a different way to accept the reports now?
No, I think to what Peggy said earlier, we have an obligation to provide a non-punitive reporting system, just culture, right, from all our employee groups, and we embrace that wholeheartedly. I think as the airline expands, it's even more important that, like I said, it's an absentee workforce. We really need to understand what they're seeing. And it's not even so much, I mean, you think about where United is going with those 787s right now, and soon our A350s. I mean, we're flying into Xi'an, Chengdu. We're going into deep Asia countries, overflying major hubs. And it's not only the city you're flying in, but it's the entire route that you need information on as to what's really happening when I check into Mongolia Center, right? And so those are the kind of things that we need. There is I see no advantage at all of tightening the spigot on that, but I actually see it opening it up. I want to see more reports. The more I see, and not me, the organization sees, the better we understand what's going on in the United system. Then I take that and we send it to ASIAS, and they start blending it. And the next thing you know, you get a view of the world that you just never knew. And I think that's the important part. So, if there are issues with understanding or trust, then we need to figure that out. but turning off a huge data source of 12,000 reports is in no one's best interest. And so I will, as long as I'm at United Airlines, I will fight for that, that's for sure.
It's a very large task for you. Is there any time that you go like, oh? And if, you know what I mean? Do you have a moment? You've got 12,000 pilots. Are you going, oh?
Well,
and if you do, can you explain it?
Yeah, that happens literally every day in our business. I mean, like I said earlier, 700, soon to be 830 airplanes flying. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I thought that people were not doing what they should do or they're not reporting what they're seeing. I mean, think about it. It's an awesome responsibility. Last year, Peggy and I were having a discussion. We flew 860 million passengers in the U.S. air transportation system without a fatality. I mean, compare that to automobiles, 33,000, railroads, 2,000, medical care, 200,000 fatalities, and that's an awesome responsibility that we all have. And I think we stepped up to it. And it gets overwhelming at times because it's not only where you're flying, but it's all you're flying to. And then multiply it by times about 200 for Peggy because she has responsibility for all this also. And so, no, it gets overwhelming, but it's something we enjoy doing. And I think when you look at it, we're all making a difference. That safety record didn't happen, right? It just didn't come out of thin air. It's everybody working together. And even that one individual report could be a nugget of gold. So that's the way I look at it.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
If I could just add, because this is something that we talk about at the FAA every day. To Mike's point, it isn't my personal responsibility to make sure every flight operates safely, or our inspector's personal responsibility to make sure every United flight flies safely. And we need to continually realize this is a team sport. And each of us has that personal responsibility, and that together we can have the kind of accomplishments that we've had. Because otherwise it does become overwhelming, or you become very conservative and you say no to everything and nothing can ever change. Because look how safe we are now, why would I want to change it? But we know change actually enhances safety. We get new technologies, we get new processes and procedures. We understand better because of things we've learned that what we were doing looked safe enough. But without having an accident or an incident, we see there's an unidentified risk that now the data shows us, and what we thought was good enough isn't good enough. Or what we thought we'd sort of eliminated from the system is actually occurring way more often than anyone would have thought it was. And it hasn't yet manifested as a catastrophic failure, and we've got the time now to go in and make those changes and make it better. But we're doing that as a community. And if any one of us feels that it's my personal responsibility to make sure everything is safe, it is overwhelming, and you won't sleep at night. So I appreciate that we are a part of this team with all of you, and that what we have to show for it, to Mike's point, it's not a miracle. It's not happenstance that the record is what it is. It is hard work and analysis and agreement to do the things that we knew we could do to enhance safety.
And let me give you one quick example. Is anytime anything happens in the industry, I'm able to go back now to my people and say, could this happen at United?
Right.
Or did it happen at United? Or did it happen and we trapped it? For example, unscheduled off-airport landings, right? And so there was an airline that had a couple. And the first thing I said to my people was, could this happen at United? And they went and did an analysis. And sure enough, we had 5 instances, but it was trapped by the procedures in the cockpit. And we saw it in the SAP report, which is great, right? And so then we reinforced that procedures or open descents on Airbuses and things like that. It doesn't happen at United, but we look at it. Flight level change on an approach because of the Asiana accident. We looked at it at United. We do all those things. That's how you, and it's all based on what we're seeing from the SAP reports and what we're seeing from FOCA data. We go in and do an analysis because even though our books say you shouldn't do it, we got to make sure we're not doing it. And that's how you manage it. That's how you manage it.
We have only a few minutes left, literally 3 or 4. So we'll take one more question at the most, and it probably have to be answered fairly briefly so we don't run behind, because I'm the first moderator. I'm not taking the responsibility of being late.
You don't get a 15-minute buffer?
Nick, thank you. From where you started to where we are, thank you. And for everyone, this question might be mainly for you, Peggy, on compliance philosophy. and not just with the pilots, but with looking at a system and the compliance philosophy of the system. My name's Anna Vahega. I'm with United Airlines, and I'm one of the report readers. So I'm reading the reports that are coming in from our pilots on what's going on. So we identify the hazards, and we measure the risk. We send the risk out. The risk is validated and verified by our flight operations department. They send it up the food chain, and a change doesn't occur. So we look at the safety assurance piece of it where we're still trying to measure. We identified this risk. These are some of our recommended changes. Perhaps other wiser people are seeing other things. How do we make those changes and measure it back? On the compliance philosophy piece, from the FAA's point of view, are they looking at that from the entire system as a whole? And then just a follow-up comment, and then I'll sit down. On the metric of a fatality for how we're doing, I think is a very good one external to a group of people such as we have here. But I think all of us know that measuring fatalities is not really a good measurement of how we're doing. And again, thank you for all your time and your perspective on that.
So let me start with the second part first. I think we would all agree that fatal accidents and fatalities is not the only measure that we want. It is clearly how the public views whether or not this industry is serving them well. And we've done very well. But that's why within CAST and ASIAS, we have a whole series of other metrics, some of them unique to the individual operators who are providing their data, some of them for us to be able to look across the system to determine, it's as simple as, although it's not easy to do, did we really implement what we intended to implement? And are we seeing the impacts that we expected to have from that implementation? And if we're not seeing those effects, go back and check implementation or determine is there something else we needed to implement in order to actually have the risk reduction that we intended to have. So there's a lot that is measured both at the individual operator level and now through CAST and ASIAS at the system level so that we can have indicators to assure ourselves that we aren't facing a catastrophic failure that we haven't anticipated or haven't tried to recognize. So I agree with you. I don't think anybody in this industry would suggest that the only measure of success is fatalities. As to the compliance philosophy, at this point, we're a year into the implementation. It has been mostly a tactical implementation by the individual inspectors with their certificate holders sort of on site. I think you raise a good point that we need to look at whether and how we can use that same philosophy at a more systems level. And I expect that we'll migrate toward that as we get a little more experience with it. Sorry.
That's great. There's a red light flashing, so as a pilot, I'm really tempted to push it, but Aaron's got a few closing comments.
And I think just in terms of the first part of the question, that's integral to how we do, and I talked about at the outset how we introduced through major changes. One of them was the adoption of a more systems level approach to surveillance and oversight. So Mike talked earlier about having beautiful manuals on the shelf that look great, but when we go in and do oversight at Transport Canada, we're going to go and look at the procedures, the manuals. We're going to make sure that the policies that Cal has put in place are adequate. Are they meeting our regulatory requirements? But it's not enough to say that they're adequate. We need to then go test those. Are they effective? Are the processes that have been put in place producing the results that we expect them to produce? Is the just culture actually being implemented, or is it lip service in a manual? So integral to how we do our oversight. And we still need to do more work, I think, in Canada on this regard. But integral to doing that is sampling and drilling down and interviewing people, talking to people, and testing whether or not those policies and procedures that are put in place, not only are they adequate for meeting the regulatory requirements, but are they effective in delivering the results that we're expecting? And I think that gets to the issue that you raised at the outset of your question.
And with that, we're going to have to wrap up this panel. Obviously, we could continue. We certainly appreciate the questions from the audience. And again, thank you all very much for taking the time to come and talk to us today. And I know for sure no one's going to have a chance to ask Cal any questions because I think he has to be at the airport in half an hour. So